we should have Andrew Marshall to present on the Bureau of Meteorology in the bush. You're linking climate science and decision making. I'm sorry, Andrew, I do not have a bio for you. That's my fault, not yours. But if you'd like to introduce yourself, that would be helpful.
Okay, thank you. I will give a brief intro. So thanks for having me here this morning. I'm Andrew Marshall I was working for the Bureau of Meteorology for 15 years, and then last month joined the University of Southern Queensland in the extension space. So my background is in research at the Bureau, looking at climate drivers across different timescales and their influences on Australian climate variability and extremes, and been involved in the program I'll talk about for the last few years, and pardon me, and moving into the extension space more so now. So I'll give a talk about that, specifically on the Bomb in the Bush, as we call it, series of extension visits associated with the Northern Australia Climate Program. So this will be about linking climate science and decision making. Great, thanks. Okay, so just a quick introduction on NACP, the Northern Australia Climate Program. So essentially the program is helping the livestock industry to manage drought and climate risk across Northern Australia. So the program's been active for a few years now. It's led by the University of Southern Queensland in collaboration with the Bureau, the UK Met Office, State Departments of Agriculture across the north, and NRMs, including Rangelands NRM here. And there are three key components. So there's research, so that's understanding the underlying science, development, so forecast development, developing the forecast model, and extension, and so that will be the focus today. But I'll talk a little bit about some of the research and development as well, and how that's fed into the extension program and into the overall program. So the extension service really is supported by a group of individuals that we refer to as climate mates. And these are individuals selected for their knowledge of the industry, and also they're very well connected across Northern Australia to various producers in key regions for the program. And so together we deliver a climate service across Northern Australia, and the climate mates are supported by Bureau, UK Met Office, and UniSQ researchers, and so together we directly engage with producers and pastoralists across the north in very interactive climate information sessions tailored to each of these regions. So these build awareness and knowledge and confidence to use the climate info, so for the producers to use that information in their decisions. Very, very much importantly as well, these visits develop trust, and they develop trust in the research and the forecast products and in the services. So these are focusing a lot on the Bureau services, but also we look at forecast products from other climate forecasting agencies around the world as well. So by building a better understanding of these forecasts and the climate drivers behind the forecasts and the science, we really help to build the trust in those products and services. So I'll focus a bit on that too. But to begin with, this is our network of climate mates that really support the extension program. And they're all very well trained up in climate drivers, and those underlying research principles. But also, they each have individual areas of expertise beyond climate. So they bring not just their experience and knowledge on the climate front, but also in different in other aspects where they can help pastoralists and producers in these visits as well. So they extend right from the west right across. So WA, Northern Territory, Queensland. You can see we have 16 climate mates at present, and you can see each of those regions where they specialise in. So I'll talk about our Bomb in the Bush visits over the last few months. So again, just to reiterate that that this has really been about getting out, into these properties to meet the producers, talking about the Bureau products and services and forecasts, and really building that trust. And so we've been on these 6 visits in the last few months since May, but of course we've been having these extension visits for the last few years as part of the program. I'll just focus on the most recent ones. So we've been to the Pilbara and Gascoyne here in WA, and then in Queensland, a visit to Muttaburra and the Gulf Country, and in the Northern Territory, right across really from Central Australia in July, and then to northern parts of the Northern Territory just last month. Okay, there might be a lag. All right, so there we go. Great. Okay, so to begin with, so the Pilbara trip was back in May, and this was led by Lauren Gibson, who you all know well, Taryn Waters, who's one of our climate mates, and Matt Wheeler from the Bureau. And they visited these stations that you can see on the screen here. And some of their key discussions were around the impacts by Tropical Cyclone Ilsa that had just previously affected the area. And in particular, in the Pilbara, they were very interested in the climate drivers El Nino and the positive IOD. And you are probably aware that over the last few months, we've seen those climate drivers building up in the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. And you may be aware that yesterday the Bureau declared that we now have an El Nino and a positive IOD. So some of the management decisions that they talked about, so as I'll show in a moment, these 2 climate drivers, when they're active, which they are now, they generally lead to drier conditions across large parts of the country, particularly across eastern and central Australia. So they talked about a delayed start to the wet season. I'll show that soon. They also talked about the bushfire risk, so increased bushfire risk, particularly during El Nino years, and also in terms of reducing stock numbers for the nutritional demand later on in the season. So some of those considerations. So the Indian Ocean dipole, kind of general schematic in terms of the role of the ocean temperatures on the circulation is shown on the left. That's the positive IOD. And on the right, the El Nino, and those are the climate conditions that we're currently experiencing. So the positive Indian Ocean dipole occurs when the western Indian Ocean warms, so it's warmer than normal by up to kind of a degree or so. The eastern Indian Ocean cools, and when this occurs, a lot of the moisture that falls over northern Australia and Indonesia during the wet season shifts over towards the western Indian Ocean region, and so there are dry conditions for Australia. During the El Nino, what we see is the eastern Pacific, or the central and eastern Pacific Ocean warming up. Again, the waters around Australia, particularly to the north, cool, and we see, again, a lot of that moisture moving into the eastern Pacific region. So during these two climate driver conditions, which can often occur together, as they are now, we see essentially the moisture, a lot of the moisture over Australia, moving away towards the west and the east. And that's what we're experiencing, and that's what we're looking at in the forecasts. So on the left there, that's the positive Indian Ocean dipole average rainfall for the October to December period. And so you can see the pink regions there represent drier than normal. The El Nino in the middle, where you can see drier than normal over the eastern half of Australia for October to December. And on the far right is the current outlook. And you can see over many of those regions where we expect to see drier conditions, that's exactly what's being forecast, and that's from the Bureau's model Access S. And so you can see those orangey, yellow-orange areas representing drier conditions forecast for October to December for much of the country. So those are the key drivers behind that forecast. So the next trip was the Gascoyne Extension Bomb in the Bush show, and this featured Elise, who's one of our climate mates, and again Matt Wheeler, and they visited these stations. There's the map on the right. And the key areas that they were really interested in were around the Gascoyne River flood of December 2010. And what they spoke about really was the combined effects of La Nina and the negative IOD in that year, and how those combined drivers really influenced that record flood. So I've just spoken about El Nino and the positive IOD. So La Nina and negative IOD, you have the opposite occurring, where you have increased moisture over Australia, particularly large parts of the north. So the management decisions that they talked about during wet years were around the implications of an early rainfall season, which they experienced that year. Paddock allocation in flood-prone areas, which is an important consideration in many regions, and also an increased chance of tropical cyclones to the northwest, which they've seen in the last few years as well with those La Nina events that we've had the last 3 years. So just to demonstrate the things they talked about, so that's the rainfall picture on the left associated with the negative Indian Ocean dipole, so the average, again, October to December. So you can see that now those green and blue areas show an increase in rainfall compared to normal. La Nina in the middle. And on the far right, the October to December, what was observed in 2010. And you can see in the Gascoyne region there, you can see some highest on record rainfall that fell during those 3 months that of course contributed to those floods. And over large parts of the country as well, there was some very much above average and record rainfall amounts. So the next trip was the Mudabara, one in Queensland, and Vicky Main, who's one of our climate mates, and Tim Cowan, who's here, representing both UniSQ and the Bureau. And so they visited Chinchilla, and they also represented NACP at the Longreach workshop, and also at the Mudabara stock show. So this was a tad different. So those previous roadshows where we went to the stations, these were very much workshop based, and so they had a bit of a different experience in meeting producers, pastoralists, and some of the discussions that they had included in how to interpret seasonal forecasts. So, part of the role of this program is to demystify forecasts. And this led to a discussion of some of the Bureau's forecast products, so including the wet season timing, and in particular in terms of products around forecasting burst rainfall amounts. And I'll touch on that in just a moment, but that's a really good example of the development part of NACP feeding into the extension. I'll just tell you a little story about that in just a moment. But some of the management decisions they discussed for delayed rain, including the fact that pasture needs to last longer with that delayed growth. There's an increased demand on water resources, of course, and there's also very much a human effect where there's no early relief, and there's a longer dry season. So those are key considerations as well. So this is the Bureau's northern rainfall onset product, and this was the last forecast that was produced at the end of August. And what you can see there is everything's basically brown, showing that there's a low chance of an early onset this year. So in other words, we're most likely to see a later start to the wet season. And of course, that's under the influence of El Nino primarily. Also the IOD can, in that positive phase, can contribute to the delay of the onset. Something to come out of these visits, and this is the great work of Tim Cowan. So Tim had some discussions last year and the year before in some of the roadshows where they talked about the available forecasts and how to interpret those forecasts. But it was clear that when there are 3-day bursts in rainfall, particularly during key stages of the wet season, and that can really stimulate pasture growth, having those heavy falls within a short period of time. And the questions were around, well, what Bureau products or other products can we use to help us to know when those kind of bursts are going to occur? And there were no such products. So we brought that back to the program, and Tim developed this new chance of 3-day totals forecast product, which is now a widely available, publicly available product on the Bureau's website. And so this came directly out of NACP and those extension-related discussions that Tim had through over the years as part of the program. So we can really see how this extension program has fed into developing these products for broad use across the country. So we went to the Gulf country in Queensland then. So this is Chelsea, who was at Uni SQ. She's just recently finished up, and I was there as well. So just Chelsea and I, and we went to these Stanbroke Cattle Group stations. And they were very interested in of course, the Gulf country floods from March this year. And that photo on the right, that's from Augusta Station. It shows the flood level on the 11th of March this year. And the last flood, which was in 2006, March 2006, you can see on the far right. And so the level was basically double their previous record. So it just shows you the extent of the floods in that region. So we talked a lot about that and how there was a tropical low that brought those conditions. We spoke about the Madden-Julian Oscillation. A show of hands, who's familiar with the Madden-Julian Oscillation? I'm just curious to know. Oh, that's a pretty good representation. So what we found was that a lot of the producers and those working on the stations weren't too familiar with the MJO. So we really covered this in some detail on this trip. And so we spoke about the failure of the 2021 to 22 monsoon. Despite the fact there was a La Nina during February and March in 2022, they had very little rainfall. And so they were asking why. So actually we had gone to the Gulf country 2 years ago, and they asked this question. And we said, well, we think it might be because of the MJO. It was probably active at that time, but we weren't really too sure. So again, this is an example of these extension trips and the discussions that we have, and in particular those face-to-face discussions feeding back into the program and into some of the research outcomes. So the Madden-Julian Oscillation, for those unfamiliar, is a pulse of cloud and rainfall near the equator that moves eastward, and it occurs about every one to 2 months roughly, and it essentially brings the bursts and the breaks in the monsoon. And we describe its evolution in 8 phases, so that's just how we describe where that burst of rainfall sits at any point in time. And that animation on the right shows, so the dial up the top right now, you can see the blue dial rotating around. So as we move through the different phases, you can see where that rainfall sits. So phases 2 and 3 we're about to come into, and you'll see that blue blob over the Indian Ocean. That's the rainfall from the MJO. Phases 4, 5 and 6, it moves over Northern Australia. That's when we typically see our monsoon bursts. Phases 7 and 8 and 1, you see the drier conditions over Northern Australia. That's typically when we see breaks in the monsoon. So in 2022, on the left here, that was the observed rainfall amount from that 2-month period. So the brown represents very much drier than normal, so a strong lack of monsoon rainfall. So we did a research study where we looked at the drivers active, and we used a regression technique to extract the rainfall associated with each individual driver. And each of the other drivers gave us generally a wet signal. That's what would have been observed if that driver was acting alone. But when you threw the MJO into the mix, it gave us dry conditions. So we knew then, we showed that the MJO was the influencer for the failure of the monsoon in February and March 2022. So that's now becoming a research paper to come out of NACP and to feed into the understanding around these kinds of events. Also, just to quickly touch on the forecasting side of things, that was the observed rainfall on the far right from from March 2022. And if you looked at the forecast in December, then for the Gulf region, it would have shown an increase in rainfall for the March 2022 month, because there was a La Nina and the MJO is predictable out to about 4 weeks. But when you get closer to that period, so if you looked at the end of February, then it picked up those dry conditions. So it's really important to come back to the forecast. If you're interested in a few months ahead, look at the forecast now to give you a general idea of what to expect based on those longer climate drivers. But you've got to come back to that forecast the closer you get, because there are shorter timescale climate drivers that can kick in and actually clobber the rainfall signal, and that's what the MJO did in that month. So keep coming back to the forecast, and this is why forecasts can change, because there are different climate drivers acting to affect these different timescales. Okay, I'll just finish quickly in the last 2 minutes with the Northern Australia trip that we did. So Emily Hines, Zoe Groves and I went to Central Australia. We travelled a fair way. We had quite a few media interviews and quite a few flat tyres too. So that kind of mixed it up a bit. We each got to change a tyre. So we had a lot of community engagement, and importantly, we saw a lot of changing perceptions, which is, really, again, one of the key outcomes from these visits. So beforehand, we heard, the forecasts are rubbish because of this, that, and the other reason. But when we explain the climate drivers and those timescales, for example, and why forecasts can change, as I just have, we heard, okay, so there's so much more to it. Okay, yeah, we kind of get that now. So they're not as bad as we thought they were, which is nice to hear. Also, the Bureau of Fence Sitters. I heard that a lot because we hadn't declared El Nino and the IOD yet. I should go back there now, shouldn't I? We just declared that yesterday. But we explained how the atmosphere needs to respond to the ocean for the El Nino to be declared. Key things. This built on, the trip really focused on building that ongoing trust and relationships that we heard Bob talk about. And finally, the Northern NT trip. Again, we covered quite a distance. We had a few media interviews along the way. So Anne-Marie Huey and Emily again from the Climate Mate group and we went out there. And there was genuine appreciation that we were out there. Again, we had more open and honest discussions from these face-to-face visits. Okay, so just to finish, my time's up. So one of the key things that we heard was they really should teach this in schools. Again, one of the key important aspects of actually being there in person and sitting there for a few hours, talking through things, showing maps, showing forecasts, answering questions. Yep. Okay, so that is everything. I'll just leave this summary slide for you. And as I just mentioned, the on-the-ground feedback directly benefits the program's research, development and extension outcomes for the benefit of everybody, really. So thanks for your time. I look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Andrew. Do we have questions? I'm sure we will have. Eager little bunch of climate watchers here. There's one over here. Emily, Sita, yep.
Hi, Roger Wicks from South Australia. You talked about a 3-day forecast for the north, but in the sort of central and southern areas, you get a rain, a germination, and then you want another rain to pick it up probably a week later or 2 weeks later, and then another rain. Is there any predictions about sort of that period?
Yeah, so this 3-day rainfall product, so we forecast that out looking at different timescales from a week to a couple of weeks ahead, and they show the likelihood of having a 3-day rainfall burst, and it also covers all of Australia, which you would have seen there. So at this stage, it's just looking at the likelihood of the occurrence of at least one 3-day rainfall burst within those periods. I'm not sure if Tim wanted to say anything more about that. He's standing over there and developed the product, but that kind of sums it up. Yep. But yeah, we can talk more about this afterwards as well. It'd be good to hear your views on that and your experience.
Thanks, Andrew. Richard Marver. Just wondering, it wasn't mentioned around the forecasting or long-term outlooks for cyclones, and last couple of years the BOM has sort of predicted above average or average cyclones, and they haven't eventuated. And we're sort of relying a lot more on that rainfall now in the southern rangelands, and obviously the Pilbara does heavily. So are you able to briefly go through some of the sort of main climate drivers of the cyclone outlooks for the year and what we're thinking this year might be, or do you not know yet?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So the cyclone outlooks are really based on the amount of moisture and heat around Northern Australia. So that really is primarily driven by the climate drivers active, particularly those longer timescale climate drivers like Indian Ocean Dipole and El Nino and La Nina. So the last 3 years where we've seen a La Nina and a negative Indian Ocean Dipole, that statistically, which means when we look over the last 30, 40 years, we've seen an increase in the number of cyclones during those phases. So statistically, we expect a high number of tropical cyclones. Each year is going to be different, and it's going to be individual. And so other climate drivers can influence the occurrence of those as well. So for example, end of last year, earlier this year, when we had Tropical Cyclone Ellie came through, that was linked to a Madden-Julian oscillation event. When there's generally more rainfall in the moisture in the system, and during El Nino negative La Nina and negative IOD. When the water around Australia is warmer, then we expect a higher number of tropical cyclones. For this year, because we're seeing a El Nino and positive IOD, we're expecting a lower number compared to normal.
We have time for one more question.
Thank you. Tony Matchett, do you have any guidance on where to look for tools to forecast future droughts, given that they're site-specific in terms of their impact, locally being a 500 mil region or 1,000 mil, what that might look like in the next 5 or 10 years? Is it just long paddock, or are there other tools?
Yeah, I was going to mention long paddock. That's probably, the most, probably one of the best places that I can think of to go to. My work has been really on that climate variability side, so I'm not fully across what else is available, but long paddock is a fantastic resource I'd highly recommend. Others here may know of other places to go, in which case, happy to hear you share those. But yeah, long paddock would be my recommendation. Yep.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. It's a topic that's becoming increasingly important in our day-to-day lives, whether we're producers or just people living in cities. So will you please thank Andrew again for a very stimulating presentation.